All right, this is the second part of our review for the third unit on the good life, which is focused on moral perfectionism. We saw last time that Aristotle has given us an argument for the conclusion that the good life is the life of moral virtue, and that's the function argument. The function argument alone doesn't really tell us all that much about what a virtuous life looks like. Specifically, it doesn't tell us what the virtues are, nor does it tell us exactly what kinds of behaviors do or don't count as virtuous. For an answer to that question and that set of questions, we're going to turn to Mencius as one way of fleshing out moral perfectionism. If you read the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle has his own way of fleshing out the details of which traits are virtues, which actions are virtuous, and so on. In Mencius, a Confucian philosopher, we get a picture of what the virtuous life is that I think in some ways is similar to Aristotle, but departs from Aristotle's picture in some other ways. So for Mencius, there are 4 natural human emotions. He calls these germs or seeds. And his view is that as a matter of human nature, we all have these emotional dispositions. Virtue for him is a stable character trait that results from using your reason to cultivate and grow these natural human dispositions, these natural emotional dispositions. And that's something that he and Aristotle have in common, the idea that emotion is sort of the raw material out of which moral virtue is fashioned, and also the idea that reason plays a key role in the development of virtue. However, Mencius identifies compassion as the most important human emotion that gives rise to a virtue that he calls benevolence, or ren. And Aristotle doesn't talk much about either the emotion of compassion or anything quite like Mencius's benevolence. Mencius also identifies 3 other traditional Confucian virtues and their corresponding emotional seeds. Shame, which corresponds to, when fully developed, dutifulness is the virtue. Courtesy and modesty are emotional states, and when they're developed appropriately, they become the virtue of observance of the rights. And then the heart of right and wrong, or a kind of internal moral compass, when developed, becomes wisdom. We in class focus mostly on compassion and benevolence, and as does really Mencius, I think. Mencius has this optimistic picture that we all are naturally disposed to feel not just those 4 emotional seeds, but in particular that we're disposed to feel compassion without much effort. If we see suffering or potential suffering right in front of us, there'll be a welling up of compassion toward the sufferer. He says no man is devoid of the heart to the suffering of others. This is what the child at the well story is supposed to illustrate. I'm not going to read that story. It's short. If you haven't read it, you should. But it's supposed to illustrate this idea that no matter who you are, you're going to have this natural tendency to feel compassion. The other story, which I also won't read, but you should certainly know it, is the story of the ox and the king. And there, the king feels a natural pity or compassion, just as the person passing by the child at the well. The king feels that compassion not toward a person, but towards this ox who's being brought to the slaughter. He sees its eyes and sees the fear in its eyes. He hears its bellowing, and he sort of emotionally, viscerally feels its terror. And he feels compassion for it, and he commands the person leading it to the slaughter not to kill it and to bring a lamb instead. And Mencius presses a little bit and says, it's interesting that you responded emotionally to the suffering of the ox, but you didn't seem to be so moved by a lamb that you had never seen and probably never would see. I mean, Mencius doesn't say, but I think the point is that the lamb is not going to be brought in front of the king, unlike the ox. So the lamb would be brought in some, back corridor or something and then slaughtered in a manner that the king wouldn't hear it. The king just didn't want to experience the suffering of the animal. And this is all in the context of the question of how can this king develop his virtue in such a way that it benefits ultimately his people. It's not primarily about animals, although I think Mencius has some important things to say about how we treat animals. Mencius says this is a kind of lesson of this story. For every man there are things he cannot bear. To extend this to what he can bear is benevolence. If a man can extend to the full his natural aversion to harming others, then there will be an overabundance of benevolence. So this idea of extending our benevolence specifically by attending to the ways in which our compassion is not, in fact, always as rational as it should be. We naturally feel compassion, but the way we feel it is attuned to irrelevant factors like, is the suffering right in front of me? Well, that shouldn't matter. If I know that there's suffering, it shouldn't matter whether I can see it or not. I should feel the same way about it, because suffering is suffering is suffering. Extending benevolence is a process by which, for Mencius, you develop the virtue of benevolence by seeing the similarities in the sufferers and seeing that your reaction of compassion to one is actually, if it's justified in the one case, it should be justified in the other case too. Once you see that, your emotions will slowly begin to follow suit. I mean, if you, for example, begin to get to know somebody better who at first you kind of had written off as somebody that you wouldn't like, and it turns out you have more in common than you thought, you may begin to open up your feelings to them and begin to like them in a way that you didn't when you first met. And Mencius looks at that and thinks, well, that's something we are familiar with, and we have to start doing the same thing on a grander scale. He says this, among babes in arms there are none that do not know to love their parents. Treating one's parents as parents is benevolence. Revering one's elders is righteousness. There's nothing else to do but extend these to the world. So we are to extend our natural feelings of compassion from our family and friends and those we can see and those that are like us outward, and increasingly to distant people and people who are unlike us and people who we don't know, and realize, in fact, the qualities that make us compassionate toward those we know are present more than we realize in those we don't. So we in class talked about a couple of critical questions for Mencius, which is, one, whether it's psychologically possible to extend our compassion in quite the way he's describing to the whole world. And then two, and this leads us to Susan Wolf, even if it is possible to, so to speak, love and feel compassion toward all, is that a desirable ideal, even if we could achieve it? It may be a morally desirable ideal, perhaps, but is it a model for well-being on the personal level? Susan Wolf says, no. Susan Wolf's piece, Moral Saints, she begins with this provocative line. I don't know whether there are any moral saints. You could think of this as the Confucian sage, or Mencius's sage, who has a sort of fully realized and extended compassion toward all beings capable of suffering. That person. Wolf is like, I don't know if that person is out there. I don't know if that's possible for a human. But if there are such people, I'm glad that neither I nor those about whom I care the most are among them. Okay. A moral saint, according to Wolf, is a person who is as morally worthy as can be. She says this, to make this a little more precise, a necessary condition of moral sainthood would be that one's life be dominated by a commitment to improving the welfare of others, or of society as a whole. So this is going to include both an emotional aspect and an action aspect. So the moral saint, if they're the Confucian version, they're going to be feeling compassion toward all suffering, right? Wherever it's occurring. And furthermore, that compassion is going to be motivating them whenever possible to act, to relieve the suffering. They won't just spare the ox, they'll spare the lamb too. And indeed, they will do whatever they can to stop the suffering of anyone that they're capable of helping. Wolff distinguishes between these two kinds of moral saints. A loving saint is somebody for whom they have this baseline commitment to devoting their lives to the well-being of others. And for them, they derive personal fulfillment and satisfaction and joy from this. This is really like the life that they've always wanted for themselves, basically. This is like their dream, right? They're very passionate about it. And when they're volunteering or donating or doing something that is relieving suffering, volunteering at an animal shelter or whatever, they're going to be feeling great about the work they're doing and come home feeling as if this is exactly what they were made to do, and they can't wait to get up in the morning and do it again. The rational saint, on the other hand, this is somebody whose personal happiness does not lie in the happiness of others. So the rational saint is not feeling fulfilled when they go, as Mother Teresa did, to the poorest of the poor and the people who are most desperately in need, on the edge of death, terribly ill, and nurse them as they die. That person, the rational saint, is not feeling great about this. They would much rather be doing something selfish. But they feel the call of morality as a duty that's impressing upon their conscience, such that they can't help but, as much as it pains them, sacrifice their lives for the lives of other people. So the loving saint is happy, is one way to think about it, and the rational saint is internally pained. But their actions are exactly the same. Wolff says, I believe that moral perfection, in the sense of moral saintliness, either the loving saint or the rational saint, does not constitute a model of personal well-being toward which it would be particularly rational or good or desirable for a human being to strive. In other words, a person may be perfectly wonderful without being perfectly moral. So we're going to try to extract a quick two-step argument out of Wolff's paper, because I think sometimes people mischaracterize Wolff as just saying, I think moral saints are no fun. Maybe that is like one thing she might say, or something like that at some point in the paper. But she's making a much deeper criticism of the life of moral sainthood than just they're no fun. It's a lot deeper than that. So we're going to try to figure out what she is trying to say. She says, there are these dispositions that we've discussed already, habits of mind and action that we call moral virtues. We talked about bravery, we talked about generosity, we talked about Mencius on compassion, wisdom, right? These are qualities that are stable dispositions or habits across time to think and feel in the right ways, and in particular in ways that are beneficial to other people. Like generosity is not just a way of feeling that you do alone in a room. When you are generous, that feeling motivates you to go out and act and benefit others. So Wolff thinks that just as there are excellent ways of being with regard to morality, we call those moral virtues, there are also non-moral virtues, which is like excellent habits or dispositions that don't necessarily benefit people, or that don't necessarily benefit anybody except the individual whose habit it is. These are, I'm not going to give a definition of these because she doesn't, but she lists a number of them. These are skills, something like playing an instrument or a sport. This is being knowledgeable, maybe of history, maybe of literature, maybe of philosophy. Non-moral virtues include interests and hobbies. I mean, she mentions an interest in gourmet cooking, or in high fashion, or interior design. This is a very, you might think of it as a little elitist, but certainly a limited list, and I'm sure she would admit that, of the possible scope of non-moral virtues. She even includes, some personality traits that aren't like hobbies or anything, but we think of people who've kind of cultivated a sense of, cool, or grace is another one she mentions, or wittiness, a kind of quick sense of wit. Like those things are excellent ways for a person to be that are not moral in any sense. And that's the background. That concept of a non-moral virtue is really, I think, the fundamental objection she has to the moral saint. Simply put, her objection is that the moral saint, by necessity, is unable to have or exercise any non-moral virtues. But the non-moral virtues are an essential part of the good life for a human being. And so the moral saint is not, in fact, capable of living the good life. Here's how we'll put it. The first premise, I think, is this. A moral saint's life cannot contain any non-moral virtues. We'll spell out why she thinks that in a second. And the second premise is a good human life must contain at least some non-moral virtues. And we'll qualify that in a second. It follows from these two, if a moral saint's life can't contain any non-moral virtues, but the good human life has to contain some, it follows that the moral saint's life is not the good life. I think that's really the structure of her argument. So let's look at this first premise. A moral saint's life cannot contain any non-moral virtues. How does she defend this claim? Why not? Why can't Gandhi or MLK or Mother Teresa, why is it that they couldn't cultivate an interest in gourmet cooking on the side, right? Why couldn't they be a movie fanatic as well? And here's Woolf's reply. She says, look, this is at bottom what we could call the crowding out problem, which is that the moral virtues, when possessed all together to the fullest degree, maximal generosity, maximal compassion, maximal wisdom, maximal self-control and temperance, maximal courage, all had by one individual, as a practical matter, they will crowd out the non-moral virtues. By the practical crowding out, she means this. One, if you are always running around doing the most good you can for other people, you literally won't have enough time in your day to also spend a couple hours each evening playing the piano, or even half an hour each evening playing the piano. She says this, in other words, if the moral saint is devoting all his time to feeding the hungry or healing the sick or raising money for Oxfam, then necessarily he's not reading Victorian novels, playing the oboe, or improving his backhand. There's just not enough time, right? Is one way to think about it. We could also, point out it's not just actually a matter of time. Even if the moral saint had enough time in the day somehow, she would run out of energy. I mean, human beings, we need sleep. We need to take a break from a single activity in order to continue going the next day. If we go for moral sainthood, we're gonna collapse and not have enough energy to be like, oh, now I'm gonna go train for my marathon. You're gonna be exhausted after you've been out helping the sick all day, or visiting people in prison, or whatever the case may be. I mean, that's emotionally and physically grueling work. There's no way you can also cultivate other excellences in your life if you really have maxed out. Now, of course, it's a trade-off. If you scale back a little bit on the amount of good you're doing, then maybe you could train for a marathon. But in that case, you won't be a moral saint anymore, because a moral saint is somebody who is as morally worthy as can be. So if you're less than perfectly worthy, you may be great, but you're not a saint. So there just are no pictures of non-Photoshop pictures like this. There are no pictures of Gandhi playing golf or of Nelson Mandela painting. Maybe there are biographical details I'm missing, and to the extent that there are, that these figures, the sort of real life saints, had side interests, I think Wolff would say maybe it turns out they're not actual saints. They're just the best we could get, or the best we've gotten in our society or in our world until now. The saint would not waste time playing golf. The saint would put down the golf club and go save a life. Similarly, no photos of MLK and Mother Teresa playing Smash. This one is photoshopped, if you couldn't tell. So there's the practical problem. She also mentions a different kind of crowding out, of the moral crowding out the non-moral. And this is like a logical crowding out. One way to think about this is that if you're extraordinarily compassionate, you might think that that as a logical matter is going to exclude being really cynical or having a dark sense of humor, right? I mean, some really great comedy is very dark, and I don't know to what extent somebody who is just overflowing with Mencius-style compassion is going to be able to appreciate a stand-up special that makes jokes that are at the expense of people who are suffering. You might think maybe that comedy is morally objectionable. That sort of comedy is just morally objectionable at all. To that extent, the moral saint is going to be nodding along and being like, yeah, that's why I can't participate in it. Likewise, you might think that somebody who is like prudent or who is wise in a practical sense is going to be somebody who is not going to be able to be too risk-taking or adventurous, right? The prudent person doesn't go on like exciting dangerous hikes without like extensively mapping it out and making sure that they're not going to end up in an area where there's danger. They're not going to just strike off without doing extensive amounts of planning. For that matter, they probably won't be doing any adventuring other than those adventures that can happen while they're at the soup kitchen, which really aren't many adventures. I think that there's also, like, if you think about, artists sometimes push moral boundaries intentionally, and it's meant to be provocative and thought-provoking, but there's also sometimes something about breaking moral constraints can have an aesthetic value if done, in an artistically appropriate way. And if you're a moral saint, all you care about is moral principles. So you might think that like an unlimited kind of artistic freedom is by necessity logically excluded if you are a moral saint. Okay, so the moral saint's life can't contain any non-moral virtues for both practical and logical reasons. Now here's the second premise. The good human life must contain some non-moral virtues. In other words, if you don't have any non-moral virtues at all in your life, then your life is not the best human life. That's my dog barking. Someone just knocked on the door. Why does she think this? Why must the good human life contain some non-moral virtues? She says a couple of things. Number one, she points out, let's think about the people we actually admire and we actually strive to be like. Maybe Gandhi's in the mix, I don't know. But realistically, she says this, we make ideals out of athletes, scholars, artists, more frivolously out of cowboys, private eyes, and rock stars. We strive for Katharine Hepburn's grace, Paul Newman's cool. We are attracted to the high-spirited, passionate nature of Natasha Rostov. We admire the keen perceptiveness of Lambert Strether. I'm not sure who that is, actually. Our actual role models, while not immoral, usually, they typically do have well-developed non-moral skills, interests, personality traits, and the like. And not only that, it's not only a matter of who we actually admire and people whose lives we actually strive toward as an ideal of well-being. Wolff says we're right to admire these qualities because non-moral virtues are virtues in the sense of good qualities. They just, and good and desirable for their own sake. They're just not moral. They're just not moral virtues, and that's okay. She says this: the feats of Groucho Marx, Reggie Jackson, and the head chef at Lutece are impressive accomplishments. Fancy. That it is not only permissible but positively appropriate to recognize as such. In general, the admiration of and striving toward achieving any of a great variety of forms of personal excellence are character traits that is valuable and desirable for people to have. So the moral saint, to the extent that they are monomaniacally pursuing morality to the exclusion of these other things, the way she puts it later is they're missing a piece of perceptual machinery. They can see the good in doing good for others, but they can't see the good in being good at chess, or being knowledgeable about a topic, or I don't know, like being a good gardener or something, like something very simple, or even just striving for that, right? She's not necessarily saying you have to be excellent at these things. Her claim is just that although no one of these interests or tastes in the category containing these latter activities, non-moral virtues, none of these could be claimed individually to be necessary to the good life. A life in which none of these possible aspects of character are developed seems to be a life that is strangely barren. So she's like, look, I'm not saying you have to be a chef in order to live the good life. I'm not like picking my own interests and saying everyone's got to be this way in order to be happy. No, you do your own thing. But she's saying there's got to be something, right? And the something can't only be I go to soup kitchens. That can play a role, but that is one part of the good life, and it's not sufficient. Other aspects of the person, the non-moral qualities, are also necessary. That is Susan Wolff's argument against moral saints, and also I think her challenge to moral perfectionism. I think it's worth thinking about whether her objections apply equally to the Mencius moral saint and to the Aristotelian moral saint. Thinking about the doctrine of the mean in Aristotle perhaps could begin to address Wolff's worry, but I don't think it completely does. So